In this video, we're going to explore an easy way to take a photo in Android, and as an added bonus, we'll get some experience with implicit intents. So the easiest approach is to take a photo and get a thumbnail. What we need for that is to add a permission to the manifest and also say that we're going to use the camera feature. Then we need to check to see if the user has granted us permission to use the camera. The reason is the camera is considered a dangerous permission. It's something that a user wouldn't assume every app is going to do. User will probably assume every app is going to access the internet, so that's considered a not dangerous permission. But camera opens up some privacy concerns, so we have to explicitly prompt the user for permission to use the camera. We're also going to take a look at onActivityResult, and that's where we get our thumbnail back from the extras in the data object. We're just going to show the thumbnail. We're not going to save it because saving it requires a few more steps, and we will tackle that in a later video. Let's start by seeing what our Android environment looks like. In a previous video in this playlist, we created a button with a camera on it, so an image button called BTN takephoto. We have not wired that up to an event handler yet, but we will do that soon. We also have an image view here, kind of with a dummy image in it, but that's at least enough to start a thumbnail. So what I'm going to do is create a new branch, and we'll call this one takephoto. We'll go ahead and check out this branch. Okay, the branch has been checked out. Most of the work that we need to do here is going to happen in our fragment. As a matter of fact, almost all the work is going to happen there. There are a couple things that we need to do in the Android manifest, though. So let's go ahead, double shift, and go to the Android manifest. Towards the top, we need to add another permission. We're going to say uses permission, and then we'll say Android, and you see this one's fairly popular. It's up towards the top there, Android permission camera. Now, we also have to indicate that our program uses the camera, and we have to indicate whether or not a camera is required to use our software. Reason being, if someone wants to download our app from the Play Store and it says that the camera is required, it'll verify that that device is actually camera enabled, or at least that that model is camera enabled. Not necessarily that the camera's working, but at least that there should be a camera there. So let's say uses feature, and then we're going to say Android name, and let's say Android.hardware.camera2. And then the important part, we'll say Android.required. False. You could still have a plant diary without a camera. Probably be more fun with the camera, but you could certainly do it without as well. Okay, now let's get to the meat and potatoes in the fragment. So first of all, we've done a bit of work here in a previous video, but if we take a look at the onCreated, we'll see that there's a view model that's linked up here, and it's calling this thing called ACT plant name, which is a component that's on our layout. Let's try to do the same thing with our button. So it's called BTN takephoto, and you see it auto-completes. One nice thing about Kotlin is this use of what they call synthetic imports, where you can get access to things that are on the XML layout just by typing it in, provided that you have the synthetic import. The synthetic import, which I did in a previous video. So if you didn't see that previous video, it might prompt you to import the synthetic import. Go ahead and do that, and then you'll have direct access to this BTN takephoto object. Now on that, I can just directly call set onClickListener. I will say in the land of Android, there are many different ways to set an onClickListener, and this is one. And then we just kind of do an inline lambda thing going on here. So what we're going to do, just to keep this onActivityCreated method a little bit lighter, I'm going to delegate this to another method we'll call preptakephoto. That way we can put all of our photo stuff in there. Alt-Enter, and let's say create function preptakephoto, just like so. So the reason why I want to do a preptakephoto is that I want to say see if we have permission or not, because we have to check for permission first. If we have permission, we can toggle the camera. If we don't have permission, we need to ask for permission. Now, I'll caution you, this is a bit of a long if test here. So if context compat, and then check self permission. So that's just saying, do I already have this permission? Now you see it takes two objects here. It takes a context and it takes a permission. So the context, well, we get that locally with context, and that's essentially calling getContext, as you see up there. It does have the question mark indicating that it can be null, so let me double exclamation to basically say, oh, I understand the risk. I'm going to assume this is not null. Now the next thing that we need here is the permission that we're requesting. So for that we go to manifest.permission.camera. There we go, a little bit better like that. So what we're doing here is, do we have this permission? That's going to return basically it was granted or it was not granted. And what we need to do, because we're in an if test, we need to do a comparison operator. So let's do double equal for comparison, and then say package manager dot permission granted. And that essentially is a constant that represents that the user has already granted this permission. If the user has granted this permission, let's call a new function, takephoto. That does not exist yet, so we'll go ahead and make that. And we'll come back to that in just a moment. Now, what if the user has not granted that permission yet? Well, let's go ahead and request it. So we'll say val permission request equals array of manifest.permission.camera. Something interesting here. When we're asking for permissions, we use a string to represent the permission instead of an object or a DTO. I itch a little bit at that because when we pass strings around, we tend to not do it in object-oriented format. But on the same note, we can ask for multiple permissions at once. In the land of Java, we would typically make a string array and pass that string array in. In Java, what we could do is take a series of strings and just comma separate them in curlies, like so. And it looked kind of funny, but that essentially created an array, and we could do boom, 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 boom. We could do a comma-separated string. Worked well in Java. In Kotlin, though, that starts to get a little bit confused with lambdas and the like. So array of is essentially the same thing. It is taking a string or a list of strings and turning it into a string array. In this case, there's only one permission we want to ask for, and it's camera permission. So that's why I wanted to spend a moment to explain this, because if you look at this not knowing that, you say, why are you doing an array of one? Well, the reason is that the permission request just knows it can't accept more than one at once. If it gets 1, if it gets 15, it wants to see them in the form of an array, and that's why we put it in an array. So let's go ahead and request permission. Now you notice that this function is coming up in autocomplete, so this is something we're asking the Android system to do. We're basically making a call out saying, can you now go request this permission, please? So let's pass in the permission request object first, and again, you notice that is a string. And then what we need is we need to put a fingerprint on this, or a self-addressed stamped envelope. And that self-addressed stamped envelope says, you're making a call outside. That call outside is going to result in a callback, or a callback to this class here. When I call that class back, I need something to identify who I am. So tell me what that is. Okay, 1997, that was a good year. Why don't we make that our code? And I'll tell you what, even better. We'll refactor that, make a constant out of it up at the top. We'll say val, which means constant, and then we'll say camera permission request code equals 1997, just like so. And then down here, we'll replace this with camera permission request code. And by being a bit verbose on this, the name of this variable, you see, it's self-documenting code. We don't have to do a whole lot of inline comments. So we're looking pretty good there. Now, we need the callback for this, though, because I mentioned this is going to result in a callback. And that callback function is called onRequestPermissionResult. Notice in Android Studio, it gives me a hint here that thinks I want to override this, and yes, indeed, I do. So let's take a look at what gets passed in. Request code. Well, that's that self-addressed stamped envelope, or fingerprint, I spoke about earlier, which is this guy right here. Because remember, we could ask for many, many permissions in many different places in this fragment. Permissions, what's being requested, and then grant result, did the user say yes? Did the user say no? So we'll go ahead and leave the super in. I don't think that's doing anything, but we do tend to like to leave supers in when we override. I do want to use something that is Kotlin specific here. We're going to say when, and then we're going to say request code. This is kind of like a case switch statement in the old days. I'm doing it like so. Even though there's only one thing I'm requesting, I go ahead and I wrap this in a when, just because I know I'll probably need to request more permissions here later. Now, the way that the when syntax works is it's saying, when the request code equals something, and that something in my case is camera permission request code. If the request code equals camera permission request code, then I do an arrow like so, and I follow it with an open close curly, and that's the behavior that will happen when the request code is equal to the camera request code. I paused the video just for a minute to show you what it would look like in Java, and this is legal Kotlin as well. Either one of these are fine. If you prefer the more traditional if test, do that. If you want to take advantage of Kotlin's when syntax, do this. Either one's going to be just the same. So inside of this, I will say, go ahead and break this into a few more lines now. I'll say if, now take a look at that last parameter, grant results. Grant results is not empty. Let's make sure we have something there. And grant results, square bracket 0, close square bracket, equal package manager dot permission granted. Okay, well then our permission was granted. So permission granted, let's do stuff. Okay, why did I do is not empty and what's the square bracket? Well, when we pass in an array of permissions, we get back an array of grant results, where essentially the 0 element represents the very first permission we requested, the 1 element would represent the next, the 2 the next, so on and so forth, all the way down. In this case, we only asked for 1 permission. So I just need to check the 0 unit, the very first compartment of that array. But first, I don't want to get a null issue or anything like that, so I just check to see if it's empty. Okay, if we're good there, then what are we going to do? Take photo. Remember that function I made earlier I said we were going to come back to. So the take photo, we haven't done that just yet, but at this point, user has requested permission, and we're going to go ahead and take photo. Now, otherwise, what we should do is we should inform the user that can't use the photo unless you give me permission. So we'll say toast.makeText, and once again, we'll do our context object, and then we'll say unable to take photo without permission, and then we'll say toast.lengthLong, and then .show. If you haven't heard of this concept of toast before, that's one of those messages that comes up on the Android screen and then automatically disappears. Caution there, they're fancy, they're handy. Don't overdo it though. Users don't tend to like to be distracted. So I tend to only use a toast in a condition like this where I'm just informing the user, well, since you didn't grant me permission, I can't use the camera. Okay, so we're looking good on permissions at the moment. The next thing we need to do is we need to take the photo. So let's go to this take photo function. And in here we'll say intent, and then we'll say media store.action image capture. So we're creating a new intent. Once again, in the land of Java, you'd probably have the word new behind here, but in Kotlin, that's not needed. So then what we say is .also. Also is kind of like when in Kotlin, because it says, okay, on this newly created object, apply the things that I'm about to do. So we'll say take picture intent, and then a little lambda expression here. Take picture intent, take picture intent, dot resolve activity, context, and then once again we're acknowledging the nullability of that, dot package manager. Okay. And then question mark indicates that this may be null. Dot also, so another also. This time we're doing operations on this take picture intent that we're using the lambda here. Little bit confusing, I know, because we have 2 alsos nested, but nonetheless, after one more line, this is what we need to toggle the camera. So we simply say startActivityForResult, and then we pass in the take picture intent that we're working with, and then we need another fingerprint or another self-addressed stamped envelope, because guess what? Once again, we are calling something on the system that's not within our program. It is the camera that's on the device, and we're going to hear back from that camera. When we hear back from that camera, it's going to come back in a callback function. And so we want to know here who we're hearing back from. So let's try one more time. Let's say camera request code. I wouldn't use the same thing as the permission request because that's a different concept, but I can go ahead and make this new variable. Let's do create property. There we go. So private val camera request code int equals 1998. Sure, that works for me. Lots of changes going on here. Definitely acknowledge that. Luckily, we're getting down to the home stretch here. So I mentioned that we're calling out to the camera. We're going to hear back from the camera. Anytime we call an intent that is outside of our program, outside of our application, and we're going to hear back from it, we'll hear back from it in the onActivityResult function. So notice I can start typing again, and Android Studio is going to help me out and say, I bet you want to override onActivityResult. I'm going to say, why, yes, I do. So let's say if result code equal result, equal result OK, means everything's good. Let's go ahead and import this. And then we're going to say if request code equal image capture, or let's just say it was camera request code, right? So camera request code, there we go, just like so. And open curly, close curly. Now we can get the thumbnail. Once again, I know I mentioned this before, but this is the function that will get called back from an external intent on our device, on our application. So we get our request code, we're using that. We get the result code, we're using that as well. The request code is our fingerprint. The result code just tells us, did the user cancel? Did the user press OK? Think about your camera. You typically have an OK and a cancel button, and this simply represents what the user selected. Now, there's one other parameter that's passed in here, which is data, and that's one that we want to use. So I'm going to say data. Now you notice it's question mark, so we need exclamation, exclamation to say we acknowledge we acknowledge there's some nullability here. We're going to assume it's not null. And then we're going to say extras. And then once again, exclamation, exclamation dot. And then get, and then in quotes data. And then we'll say as bitmap. In Kotlin, doing as like that is essentially a cast. So let's save this to val image bitmap. Save it to a variable like so. And now let's try to get access to image view on our layout. Now I paused the video for a moment so I could pop over there. I noticed I didn't give this a really good name. Let me go ahead and rename this. I'm going to call it IMG plan. Okay, with that I go back to our fragment. And now let's say IMG plant. Oh wow, look, that was really fast. I'm impressed with how quickly it recognized that. And then set image bitmap. And we'll pass in our image bitmap. Now I've loaded our application in the emulator in debug mode, and I've set breakpoints in several of the methods that we've created. Let's watch what happens when I press the camera button. We see the first thing that comes up is the preptakephoto. Give us a little more room here. And so, do I have permission? We'll choose F8 on this. And we see it jumps down to the else part, which indicates that I do not have permission yet. And that makes sense because this is the first time we have stepped into this debugger, the first time we've installed the application on our emulator, so we have not yet asked it for permission. To show you what the emulator is doing, currently still standing still as it waits for us to walk through the debugger. So let me go through now and choose F8 and then F9 on this permission request. And you see, as soon as I do that, we get a little dialog that comes up and the screen kind of goes dark underneath. Let's go ahead and choose allow here. And now as soon as I choose allow, notice what happens next. We come to the onRequestPermissions result. Remember, this is where we go anytime the user has accepted or declined a permission. And we have this when statement that we just put together a few moments ago. So I press F8 and we see, okay, were permissions granted? Well, if you remember, I did grant permissions, so you see it takes us down to the takephoto function. I pressed F7 and now it's going to prepare the camera. I'll show you once again what the screen currently looks like, what the emulator looks like. And you see, still looks like that. It's simply waiting for us to continue this debugger session. So choose F9. And we come back and here's the camera. And I press the camera button. Now notice it gives me a check and an X. And remember I talked about result OK. That's what we'll get if we press the checkbox. If we press the X, it will be result canceled. So we press the check, and look what happens next. We get our onActivityResult. Did the user press OK? Well, if you remember, I certainly did. Are we hearing from the camera request? Well, we sure are. Okay, Let's get a bitmap from the camera, and I don't know that mousing over is going to tell us a whole lot, but we can at least get an idea that it is indeed a populated and live bitmap. Now let's take that bitmap and let's set that into our image view just like so. I probably need to redo my constraint weightings, but nonetheless you see sure enough it took that image and it's now showing us that image. Now I paused the camera, uninstalled and reinstalled the app so we could get that permission prompt again. What happens this time when I press the camera and I get prompted? I uninstalled the app, I anticipate that I don't, and sure enough I don't. You can also go into system settings and revoke permission. You don't have to uninstall necessarily, but nonetheless, we see it's about to request permissions from me. There we go. And this time we're going to say deny. Okay, we come back to our callback method, F8, F8. Were the permissions granted? No, they were not granted. So what do we do then? You notice we get the toast, unable to take photo without permission. Not a problem though, because the next time that we go in, we can go ahead and allow this permission, and we'll go ahead and choose F9. Now let's take the photo, but this time instead of checking the checkbox, let's hit the X. And we see we're going to come back to the onActivityResult method. Was result code equal to result OK? I'm just going to press F8. We see no, it's not, so it skips this entire block. We look back at the emulator and we see that it's not showing us a thumbnail. So this is a quick look at invoking the camera, getting a thumbnail. I hope this video has been helpful and I look forward to reading your comments. Thank you.